The dirt on my father's grave hadn't even settled when my stepmother hurled my duffel bag down the marble staircase of the house I grew up in. "Pack your things and crawl back to whatever base spat you out," Candace shrieked, her face contorted into something I barely recognized. "This house is mine now. You don't belong under this roof anymore." Beside her, my half-brother Julian smirked like a man holding a winning lottery ticket, waving a tattered legal folder over his head, like a trophy he'd earned instead of stolen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let a single tear fall. I had stared down insurgents in the mountains of a war zone most people couldn't find on a map. Two grieving in name-only opportunists in designer black were not going to be the thing that broke me. I picked up my bag from the floor where she'd thrown it, looked her dead in the eye, and said one word. "Okay." What Candace didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly known, was that 48 hours before my father's heart stopped beating, I had already been sitting in a locked office in downtown Richmond, signing my name to documents that made every threat she was screaming at me completely, laughably meaningless. If you're new here, stay until the end, because this is the kind of story that makes you sit up a little straighter. And if you want, drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I like knowing how far these stories travel. My name is Willow Grant. I'm 32 years old, and for the last 10 years I have served as a major in the United States Army. I have led soldiers through hostile terrain in the dead of night. I have made split-second decisions that meant the difference between a unit coming home whole or coming home in pieces. I learned a long time ago that composure isn't the absence of feeling, it's the refusal to let feeling run the show when it matters most. But nothing in 10 years of service prepared me for the ambush waiting for me inside my own childhood home. I still remember the exact moment I decided to enlist. I was 22, fresh out of college with a business degree my father had quietly hoped would land me a seat at Grant Enterprises one day. I sat him down in his study, the one with the tall windows overlooking the back gardens, and told him I wanted to serve instead. I braced myself for disappointment. Instead, he stood up, walked around his desk, and hugged me so tightly I could feel his heartbeat against my shoulder. "You were never going to be happy behind a desk, Willow," he told me that night. "You've got too much fire in you for spreadsheets. Go be who you're supposed to be. I'll be prouder of you in that uniform than I ever would have been watching you inherit a title you didn't earn." I thought about that conversation more than once during the years that followed, through basic training, through officer candidate school, through 2 deployments where I learned to read the silence before an ambush the way other people read a room. My father called me every single Sunday, no matter the time difference, no matter how bad the connection. He never once asked me to come home and take over the business. He only ever asked if I was eating enough and sleeping enough, and whether I needed anything sent over that the commissary didn't carry. Candace married him 4 years into my career, after my own mother passed from cancer when I was still in high school. I gave her the benefit of the doubt for a long time, longer than I probably should have. I told myself grief made people cautious, that trust took time to rebuild after loss. It took me almost a decade to understand that Candace hadn't married my father out of love. She'd married him out of arithmetic. I had taken emergency leave the moment the Red Cross message reached my company commander. 3 lines of text that rearranged my entire world. Father, Arthur Grant, hospitalized, critical condition, cardiac event. Requesting immediate family notification and travel authorization. By the time my authorization cleared and my boots hit the tarmac in Virginia, he was already gone. Heart failure, sudden and merciless, the kind that doesn't wait for you to say goodbye. The rain was unrelenting the day I landed, sheeting sideways across the windshield of the rental car, blurring the wreaths that had already begun piling up at his memorial like the world knew exactly how much this man had meant to people. I drove straight from the airport to Grant Manor, still in my service dress uniform, because there hadn't been time, or maybe I hadn't let myself make time, to change into anything softer. I stood outside those heavy oak double doors for a long moment before I pushed them open. I told myself I just wanted 5 minutes of quiet. 5 minutes to stand in the foyer, where I used to slide across the marble floor in socked feet as a kid, where my father used to swing me up onto his shoulders after a long day at the office, where the smell of a cedar aftershave still seemed to hang faintly in the air even now. I did not get 5 minutes. Standing at the top of the grand marble staircase, backlit by the chandelier like she'd staged the moment on purpose, was Candace. Beside her, arms crossed and chin tilted with the particular arrogance only a spoiled 26-year-old can muster, stood my half-brother Julian. Candace was dressed head to toe in tailored black silk, diamond earrings catching the light with every small, deliberate movement of her head. Those earrings alone probably cost more than 4 months of my military salary. Her arms were folded tight across her chest, and her eyes, the same eyes that used to fake warmth at Thanksgiving dinners for my father's benefit, had already gone cold. I didn't even have my coat off before she started. "Don't bother unpacking, Willow," she announced, her voice ringing off the foyer walls like she'd rehearsed the acoustics. "Your father is gone, and so is your welcome. This estate belongs to us now." Julian let out a short, ugly laugh as he descended the staircase, a thick stack of papers bound in a blue legal folder clutched in one hand. He held it up in front of my face like a prize fighter's belt, close enough that I could smell the cologne he'd clearly put on for this exact performance. "Take a good look, Major," he sneered, dragging the word out like an insult instead of a rank I'd bled to earn. "This is Dad's last will and testament, 5 years old, signed, sealed, notarized. Every share of the family company, the manor, the Manhattan penthouse, all of it goes to Mom and me. You picked your little camouflage adventure over the family business a long time ago, so congratulations, you get exactly what you chose. Nothing, not a cent, not even a guest room." Candace stepped down to join him, closing the distance between us until she was standing well inside the space most people instinctively respect. Her eyes were doing that calculating thing they always did, like she was pricing me out of a room. "Your father's final wishes were very clear, Willow," she said, dropping her voice into something almost gentle, almost reasonable, which somehow made it worse. "Bloodline is one thing, loyalty is another. You weren't here managing his household. You weren't here keeping his schedule, sitting with him at doctor's appointments, holding this family together while he faded. We were." I looked at the two of them for a long moment and said nothing. I let the silence stretch, because I wanted her to feel the weight of the lie she'd just told standing on my father's grave. The hypocrisy was almost breathtaking in its scale. During the 6 months my father's health had steadily unraveled, I was the one dialing into his cardiologist appointments from a supply closet at 400, because it was the only quiet place on base with a signal. I was the one who memorized his medication schedule and called the house nurse every single evening between briefings, no matter how exhausted I was. Candace, meanwhile, had spent that same stretch of time sunning herself on the French Riviera on his credit cards, posting photos with captions about self-care, while her husband's heart quietly gave out one arrhythmia at a time. Julian had spent it wrapping a rented Lamborghini around a guardrail and then begging his dying father, through tears that evaporated the second the check cleared, to make the accident, and the gambling debts underneath it, quietly disappear. Neither one of them had spent a single evening sitting beside his bed in the dark, just listening to him breathe. I remembered one call in particular, maybe 4 months before he died. It was almost 2 a.m. my time, and I'd stepped outside the operations tent just to get a signal, the desert cold enough that I could see my own breath while I talked. My father's voice had sounded thinner than usual, worn down at the edges in a way that scared me more than I let on. "I don't want you worrying about me out there, Willow," he'd said, and I could hear the effort it took him to keep his voice steady. "You've got a job to do. I raised you to finish what you start." "You raised me to know when something's wrong too," I told him. "And something's wrong, Dad, I can hear it." He'd laughed softly, the sound catching a little in his chest. "You always could see straight through me, must get that from your mother." He never told me, in all those calls, exactly how bad things had gotten with Candace and Julian. I think he was trying to protect me from it, the same way he'd protected me from every hard thing, since I was a little girl standing at my mother's funeral in a black dress 2 sizes too big. It wasn't until Raymond opened that dossier that I understood the full shape of what he'd been carrying alone. And yet here they were, dressed like they were attending a coronation instead of standing over a fresh grave, ready to carve up a fortune they were certain was already theirs. What they didn't know, what neither of them could have possibly guessed, was that 48 hours before my father drew his last breath, I had sat across a mahogany table from a man who would quietly hand me the truth that changed everything. My flight, as it turned out, had landed 2 full days before the funeral, though almost no one knew that. Instead of driving straight to the estate, I'd gone to a private office suite in downtown Richmond, where my father's longtime personal attorney, Raymond Vance, was waiting for me. Raymond wasn't one of the slick corporate lawyers who orbited my father's company, the kind with a different watch for every day of the week. Raymond had known my father since they were both 26 years old and broke, building the first version of Grant Enterprises out of a rented warehouse with more ambition than capital. My father trusted Raymond with things he wouldn't tell his own doctor. When I walked into that office, Raymond stood, shook my hand with both of his the way he always had since I was a kid, and gestured for me to sit. On the table between us sat a thick, sealed, leather-bound dossier, the kind of thing that looks unremarkable right up until you understand what's inside it. "Willow," he said, his voice careful in a way that told me whatever was coming wasn't going to be easy to hear. "Your father asked me to show you this the moment you landed, before anyone else got to you first. I'm sorry it has to happen this way." Inside that dossier were forensic financial audits, offshore registry filings, certified private investigator reports, complete with photographs and bank statements and timestamps, laid out with the cold precision of evidence prepared for a courtroom. My father, it turned out, had discovered months earlier that Candace wasn't simply neglecting him emotionally. She was actively betraying him. She'd been carrying on an affair with a regional banking executive for over a year, meeting him under the flimsy cover of wellness retreats and girls' trips. Worse, she and Julian had been quietly siphoning money out of company payroll accounts, funneling it through a web of shell corporations registered in 3 different countries, none of which existed for any purpose other than hiding stolen money. My father had built an empire with his bare hands, and the people he trusted to inherit it had spent the final chapter of his life quietly robbing him blind while smiling at him across the dinner table. He was heartbroken. Raymond told me that much plainly, but my father was many things, and defenseless was never one of them. In the months after he uncovered the betrayal, while his own heart was failing him a little more every week, Arthur Grant had spent every ounce of remaining strength outmaneuvering the 2 people trying to outmaneuver him. He revoked the outdated 5-year-old will Julian was so proud of clutching. In its place, he quietly established an irrevocable family trust, naming me, his daughter, the one who'd chosen a uniform over a boardroom seat, as the sole executor and primary beneficiary of everything that actually mattered. The numbers alone were staggering. Controlling stakes in 3 defense technology firms, commercial real estate holdings spread across 3 states, offshore liquid investment accounts that, added together, totaled north of $40 million. "Your father wanted you protected above everything else, Major Grant," Raymond told me that day, sliding a folder of authenticated certificates and private access credentials across the table toward me. He knew exactly what their greed would look like the moment his heart stopped. He built this so that when it showed itself, you'd already be standing somewhere they could never touch. I sat in that office for a long time after Raymond finished speaking, holding documents that made me, quietly and irrevocably, one of the wealthiest people in the state of Virginia. And then I did something that surprised even Raymond. I asked him not to tell anyone, not yet. "Let them show me exactly who they are first," I told him. "I want to watch them play the hand they think they're holding." Raymond studied me for a long moment, the way he used to when I was a kid sneaking cookies out of his briefcase during business meetings at the house. "Your father used to say you had the steadiest hands he'd ever seen on a person," he said finally. I understand now what he meant. Before I left his office that day, I called one person, my closest friend from officer candidate school, a woman named Priya Akaffer who'd since made captain and was stationed 2 bases over. I hadn't planned on telling anyone, but the weight of that dossier was heavier than I expected to carry alone for 2 more days. "Say that again," Priya said when I told her, her voice flat with disbelief over the phone line. "Your stepmother is embezzling from your dying father's company, and he found out, and he restruck. You're the entire estate to protect you, and you're telling me you're going to just, let her throw you out first." "I want the record to be airtight," I told her. I want there to be no question, anywhere ever, about who showed up for him and who showed up for the money. If I show my hand now, it becomes a story about a will. I want it to be a story about the truth." Priya was quiet for a second. "You're a scary person, Willow Grant, you know that, right?" "I learned from the best," I said, and for the first time in 2 days, I actually laughed. The 2 days between that meeting and the confrontation on the staircase were some of the strangest of my life. I attended my father's funeral in my dress uniform, standing at rigid attention beside his casket, while Candace performed grief for an audience of business associates and society friends, dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. I watched Julian accept condolences with an expression of practiced solemnity that vanished the instant people looked away, replaced by something closer to impatience, like he was waiting for the eulogies to wrap up so the real business of collecting could begin. I said nothing. I gave nothing away. 10 years of military discipline had taught me how to hold a neutral expression through far worse than this. At one point during the reception afterward, an elderly woman I recognized as one of my father's oldest business partners took my hand and pressed it between both of hers. "Your father talked about you constantly, you know," she said, her eyes glassy with tears that seemed, unlike Candace's, entirely genuine. "Every fundraiser, every dinner party, Willow this, Willow that. He kept a photo of you in your dress uniform on his desk at the office. Told everyone who asked that his daughter was the bravest person he'd ever known." I hadn't known about the photo. I found out later, from one of his longtime assistants, that it sat exactly where the woman said it did, framed in dark walnut, positioned so it was the first thing visitors saw when they walked into his office. Candace, apparently, had asked him more than once to move it somewhere less visible. He never did. That was the moment, standing in that reception hall in my dress uniform, while Candace worked the room like a hostess auditioning for a role, that any lingering guilt I might have felt about letting her walk into her own trap completely evaporated. My father had spent his final months building me a shield. The least I owed him was the patience to let it work exactly as he intended. So when Candace threw my bag down the staircase 2 days later and told me I didn't belong under that roof, I didn't correct her. I didn't reach into my jacket and produce the trust documents right there in the foyer, though God knows some part of me wanted to see her face crumble in real time. I let her have her moment. I let Julian wave his outdated will around like a conquering hero. I picked up my duffel bag, walked back out into the rain, and checked into a modest hotel off the interstate, where I spent the evening reviewing every page Raymond had given me with the same focus I'd once used to study terrain maps before a mission. Because the brilliance of my father's plan wasn't only in what he'd secured for me, it was in what he'd left behind for them. It was a poison pill, dressed up as an inheritance. When Arthur discovered the embezzlement, he understood immediately that simply cutting Candace and Julian out of the will entirely would trigger a drawn-out, ugly, very public probate battle, months, possibly years, of litigation that would drag the family name through court filings and tabloid headlines. He didn't want that. He wanted something cleaner, something that would let their own greed do the punishing for him. Over his final 6 months, working quietly through Raymond and a small circle of trusted financial advisors, my father restructured nearly every asset tied to that outdated 5-year-old will. He took out a second mortgage against Grant Manor, over $3.2 million, secured against a house Candace believed was an untouchable trophy. He encumbered the Manhattan penthouse with outstanding structural loans tied to renovations that had never actually happened, just paperwork designed to attach debt to a deed. And in the quietest move of all, he transferred the mounting supplier liens and operating debts from his company's aging manufacturing divisions directly into the very shell corporations Candace had illegally set up to hide her stolen money, corporations she now, unknowingly, owned outright. Every dollar of real equity that flowed out of those restructured accounts landed in one place: the Whitaker Grant Irrevocable Trust, under my sole control. Raymond walked me through the mechanics of it that first night in the hotel room, spreading documents across a bedspread that still smelled faintly of industrial detergent while rain tapped Aga. "In's the window." He explained how the shell corporations Candace had set up under a cousin's name to hide the stolen payroll funds had, through a series of entirely legal transfers my father orchestrated with the help of a forensic accountant, become the designated holding entities for every liability the manufacturing division no longer wanted on its books. Candace thought she was building herself an escape hatch. In reality, she was digging the foundation of her own prison, one shell company at a time, and she never once thought to check the plumbing. "Your father wasn't angry when he did this," Raymond told me, closing the last folder. "That's the part I want you to understand. He wasn't punishing her out of spite. He told me more than once that he just wanted the truth to be undeniable by the time it came out. He didn't want a courtroom deciding who deserved what. He wanted the paperwork to make the decision for everyone, permanently, so there'd be nothing left to argue about." I thought about that for a long time after Raymond left. My father had spent 40 years building a company from nothing, and he'd spent his final 6 months building something quieter, and, in its own way, far more impressive, a trap so precise that greed itself would be the only thing required to spring it. Candace and Julian believed they were seizing $30 million in luxury real estate and prestigious corporate shares. In reality, they were about to inherit legal entities buried under more than $5 million of debt, unpaid property taxes, and vendor default notices that were already, quietly, in motion. They were so hungry to destroy me that they never once stopped to check what they were actually fighting over. And every dollar of real value had already left the building 48 hours before my father's heart gave out. The formal estate distribution meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp inside the glass-walled executive boardroom at Grant Enterprises headquarters, 12 floors above the city with a view. Candace had always loved to show off to guests. She and Julian arrived 20 minutes early, dressed like they were walking a red carpet instead of attending a legal proceeding. Candace wore an extravagant cream Chanel suit, an alligator skin handbag hooked over one forearm, radiating the kind of triumph you only see on people who have never once considered they might be wrong. Julian trailed behind her, in a suit that fit a little too well for a man about to inherit debt he didn't know existed, scrolling through his phone with the bored confidence of someone who already considered himself the new head of the company. Their private attorney sat beside them, smug and unbothered, laying the 5-year-old draft will out on the table like it was the only document that mattered. When the heavy double doors opened, their expressions brightened. I could see it in their faces. They expected me to walk in broken, tired, ready to beg for a modest settlement and slink back to my base with my tail between my legs. Instead, I stepped into that boardroom in my pressed service uniform, spine straight, eyes locked forward, every inch the officer who had walked into rooms far more hostile than this one and walked back out again on my own terms. Flanking me was Raymond Vance, carrying 2 sealed steel briefcases, trailed by a full team of senior forensic auditors whose presence alone made Candace's smile falter for just a fraction of a second. "Well, Major Grant," Candace began, leaning back into her leather chair with false sweetness dripping from every syllable, "I do hope you've come here ready to accept that today is simply a formality. We're prepared to offer you a small relocation allowance. Out of the kindness of our hearts, of course." Raymond didn't sit down. He unlatched both briefcases, pulled out a thick stack of authenticated probate filings, and set them down on the mahogany table with a sound that landed like a verdict. "Mr. and Mrs. Grant," he said, his voice carrying the calm, unshakable authority of a man who has never once lost a case he cared about winning, "the document currently in your possession was formally revoked 6 weeks prior to Arthur Grant's passing." He let that sentence sit in the air for a moment before turning the next page. "Under the terms of the Whitaker Grant Irrevocable Trust, Major Willow Grant is the sole heir to $40 million in liquid capital, proprietary technology patents, and prime commercial real estate holdings across 3 states. Candace's smug expression drained from her face in real time, color leaving her cheeks like someone had pulled a plug. Raymond turned another page. "As for the residential manor and the associated shell entities the two of you fought so vigorously to secure, they belong to you, outright, along with $5.4 million in immediate personal debt obligations, effective as of this morning." For a moment, nobody in that boardroom moved. The only sound was the soft hum of the building's ventilation system and the faint rustle of paper as one of the auditors flipped to a marked page in her own copy of the filings, ready to answer any challenge before it was even raised. Then the boardroom dissolved into chaos. Their attorney snatched up the certified deeds and forensic audit reports, hands visibly trembling as he scanned page after page, before leaning over to whisper something to Candace that made her go rigid. The filings, he told her, I heard it clearly, because he didn't bother lowering his voice enough, were airtight. Binding. Completely, permanently irreversible. Candace shot to her feet, so fast her chair toppled backward, and hit the floor with a crack that silenced the room. "This is fraud," she shrieked, the composed, coiffed mask she'd worn for 2 days finally shattering completely. "This is an illegal conspiracy. Arthur would never do this to his own family. You manipulated him, Willow. You must have, there's no other explanation." Julian gripped the edge of the table, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the full weight of the numbers finally landed. Every sports car, every country club membership, every reckless purchase he'd ever made had been quietly tethered to corporate accounts that were, as of that morning, frozen under active creditor claims. Within 48 hours, the banks would begin foreclosure proceedings on the encumbered manor. Within a week, process servers would be arriving at whatever address he was staying at with default notices totaling millions. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I rose from my seat and walked slowly toward the head of the table, looking down at both of them with the same cold, controlled precision I'd once used to secure a compromised perimeter under enemy fire. "My father didn't manipulate you, Candace," I said, my voice even and completely without heat. "He simply let you harvest exactly what you spent months quietly planting behind his back." I reached over and pressed the intercom button mounted on the boardroom wall. Within seconds, 2 members of building security stepped through the double doors and took up position on either side, waiting. I looked Candace directly in the eye, and for the first time in 2 days, I let a small, deliberate smile cross my face, the exact mirror of the cruel little smirk she'd given me at the top of that marble staircase. "Security will escort you both out now," I said quietly, "because just like you told me 2 days ago, you don't belong here." Julian tried one last time as the security guards moved toward him, his voice cracking somewhere between rage and pleading. "You can't do this to us, Willow. We're family. He was my father too." I turned to look at him, and for just a second, I let myself remember the boy he used to be, younger, before the money and the entitlement had calcified into whoever he'd become. There was still, somewhere underneath it, a flicker of the little brother who used to beg me to teach him pull-ups in the backyard. "He was your father," I said quietly, "but you were never his son when it counted. You were his liability, and liabilities eventually come due." The doors closed behind them a few minutes later, and the boardroom went very still. Raymond began quietly gathering the remaining paperwork, and one of the junior auditors let out a breath she'd clearly been holding for the better part of 20 minutes. "You didn't have to let it go that far," Raymond said gently, once the room had mostly cleared. "You could have shown them the trust the day you landed and spared yourself the staircase." "I know," I said, looking out through the glass wall at the city spread out below, gray and steady under a sky that was finally starting to clear. "But some lessons only stick if people get to watch themselves earn them." 3 months later, Grant Manor went to auction, sold off in a single afternoon by the lenders who'd been circling it for weeks. Julian filed for personal bankruptcy less than 6 weeks after the boardroom meeting and now works an entry-level logistics job, spending most of his paycheck chipping away at debts that will likely follow him for the next decade. Candace moved into a cramped 1-bedroom apartment in a suburb she once would have refused to drive through, her designer wardrobe slowly making its way to consignment shops to cover rent. I took the $40 million my father left me and did something I know, without a shred of doubt, would have made him prouder than any corner office ever could have. I established the Arthur Grant Veteran Transition Foundation, funding transitional housing, mental health resources, and career retraining programs for service members coming home, and trying to figure out how to build a life on the other side of a uniform. I brought Priya on as the foundation's first director of operations, and together, we spent that first spring tourney. A warehouse not unlike the one my father started his company in, half empty, echoing, full of potential nobody else could see yet, into something that actually mattered. We hired a small team of case managers, most of them veterans themselves, who understood in a way no outside consultant ever could exactly what it felt like to come home to a country that expected you to just slot back into civilian life like nothing had happened. Raymond stayed on as general counsel for the foundation, working, he told me once, for a fraction of what he used to bill my father's company. Some things you don't do for the money, he said, when I tried to argue the point. Your father taught me that a long time before he taught you. I kept Grant Manor's old carriage house, the smallest, least valuable structure on the original property, technically still tangled up somewhere in Candace's mess of liabilities before the lenders sorted it out, and quietly bought it back at auction under a name that wasn't mine. I didn't want the big house. I never had. I renovated the carriage house instead, small and simple, and hung one photograph on the wall of the study. My father, mid-laugh, sitting behind his old desk with the framed picture of me in uniform visible just over his shoulder. Standing outside the Foundation's new headquarters on opening day, watching the first group of veterans walk through the doors, some nervous, some skeptical, a few of them crying before they'd even made it past the lobby, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt since before the Red Cross message ever reached my command post. A deep, quiet peace, knowing that my father's real legacy wasn't marble staircases or offshore accounts. It was discipline. It was quiet strength. It was standing tall against the people who try to convince you that you don't belong somewhere you have every right to be. I ran into Julian once, months later, in the parking lot of a hardware store not far from his new apartment. He looked thinner, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, wearing a company polo from the logistics warehouse where he'd started working the entry-level shift nobody else wanted. For a moment neither of us said anything. Then he nodded at me just once and said, "The Foundation. I saw it on the news. That's good work, Willow." "Thank you," I said and meant it. He hesitated, like he wanted to say something else, then seemed to think better of it and got into his car instead. I watched him drive off and felt, to my own surprise, something closer to sadness than satisfaction. Not enough to change anything. Just enough to remind me that even the people who hurt us the worst usually started out as someone we loved. I never heard from Candace directly. I heard about her, occasionally, the way you hear about people who used to matter and no longer do. A mutual acquaintance mentioning she'd taken a job at a department store counter. Another mentioning she'd been seen at a consignment shop trying to sell the same Chanel suit she'd worn to that boardroom meeting. I felt nothing when I heard those things. Not triumph, not pity. Just the quiet, settled knowledge that the world has a way of eventually handing people exactly what they built for themselves, whether they meant to build it or not. On the first anniversary of my father's death, I drove out to the cemetery alone, in civilian clothes for once, and sat on the grass beside his headstone the way I used to sit on the floor of his study as a kid, listening to him talk about the company, about people, about what it meant to build something worth leaving behind. I told him about the Foundation. I told him about the first veteran we'd helped find stable housing, a former corporal who'd been sleeping in his car for 4 months before one of our case managers found him a place. I told him I finally understood what he'd meant, all those years ago in his study, about having too much fire to sit still behind a desk. "You didn't leave me a fortune, Dad," I said quietly, to a headstone that couldn't answer but somehow still felt like it was listening. "You left me a mission, and I intend to finish it. So now I want to ask you, if you were standing in that foyer, bag thrown down the stairs at your feet, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story hit you the way I hope it did, stay close, there are 2 more waiting for you right now.